Imagine pulling up to a gas station in 1941 and paying $1 to fill your entire tank. Not a few gallons. The whole thing, $1. Now imagine that fuel didn't come from a pump drilled into the earth. It came from a farm, from a plant so common it grew like a weed across the American countryside. And imagine the man behind that idea wasn't some eccentric inventor working in a garage. It was Henry Ford, the most powerful automaker in the world. The man who built the assembly line, the man who put America on wheels. He had a plan, a complete, working, fully realized plan to make oil companies obsolete forever. And for one brief, brilliant moment in history, that plan was actually working. Then it vanished. Not slowly, not quietly, overnight. And almost nobody alive today knows it ever happened. This is the story they never taught you in school. The story of the car that ran on plants, the fuel that cost almost nothing, and the silent war that buried both of them before the world ever got the chance to see them. It started with a smell. In the summer of 1941, a journalist visiting Ford's experimental laboratory outside Dearborn, Michigan, reported something strange. The moment he walked through the door, he said it didn't smell like a factory, it smelled like a bakery, sweet and warm and oddly familiar. He had expected engine grease and metal shavings. Instead, the air was thick with something that smelled almost like fermenting grain. He followed the smell to a back room where workers were running tests on a fuel system unlike anything he had seen. The engine was running. It was running smoothly. And the tank attached to it was filled with a pale golden liquid that Ford's engineers were calling agricultural ethanol. Plant alcohol. Fuel grown in a field, not pumped from the ground. The journalist stood there for a long time watching the engine run. He asked the lead engineer how long it had been going. The engineer smiled. He said 3 days straight. No break. That detail stuck in the journalist's mind for decades. He wrote about it later in a memoir that almost nobody read. But the detail that really haunted him wasn't the engine. It was what the engineer said next. He leaned close and said this engine could run forever on crops. They would never need oil again. 3 weeks later, the project was classified. The laboratory was quietly shut down. And Henry Ford never spoke publicly about plant fuel again. To understand why that moment matters, you have to go back much further. All the way back to before oil was king. Before Standard Oil, before John D. Rockefeller had turned petroleum into the blood of modern civilization, back to a time when the future of fuel was genuinely open, when engineers and farmers and inventors were still racing to figure out what would power the machines of the coming century. In the 1880s and 1890s, when the first true internal combustion engines were being developed, gasoline was not the obvious choice. It was not even a particularly good one. It was flammable, volatile, and difficult to refine cleanly. Early engines ran on everything from coal gas to turpentine to whale oil, and ethanol, alcohol distilled from grain or plants, was considered one of the most promising candidates of all. Nikolaus Otto, the German engineer who built the first practical four-stroke engine in 1876, designed it to run on ethanol. Not gasoline. Ethanol. When Otto sat down to choose a fuel for his invention, he looked at what was available, what was stable, what was cheap, and what was renewable. And ethanol won every category. Even the United States government agreed with the logic. In 1906, Congress repealed a wartime tax on industrial alcohol, specifically to encourage its use as engine fuel. The Secretary of Agriculture publicly stated that America's farms could power America's machines indefinitely. The future, in 1906, looked green. Not in the environmentalist sense, literally green, fields of green plants growing fuel, farmers doubling as energy producers, the internal combustion engine and the American farm working as a single elegant system. That was the vision. And it was very nearly the reality. Then something happened that changed everything. And it didn't happen slowly. It happened with the precision of a trap snapping shut. John D. Rockefeller was not a man who left things to chance. By the turn of the 20th century, he had already built Standard Oil into the most powerful private corporation in American history. He controlled roughly 90% of all oil refining in the United States. He owned pipelines, railroads, storage facilities, and political connections in every major city in the country. He was, by almost any measure, the most powerful private individual on the planet. And in 1919, he did something that most history books gloss over entirely. He donated enormous sums of money to the temperance movement, the campaign to ban alcohol in America. At first glance, that seems like an act of moral conviction. Rockefeller was a devout Baptist. He genuinely believed in the dangers of drinking. But there is another side to that donation that historians have noted with increasing clarity over the decades. Banning alcohol didn't just close down saloons. It made industrial ethanol illegal. Under Prohibition, producing alcohol in any form, including the kind used as engine fuel, became a federal crime. Almost overnight, ethanol disappeared as a viable alternative to gasoline. The competition was eliminated, not by market forces, not by engineering, by law. by the same federal government that 6 years earlier had been encouraging farmers to grow fuel crops. Standard Oil's market position became untouchable, and the roads of America began filling up with gasoline-powered cars. But here is the part they never tell you in school. Henry Ford saw exactly what was happening, and he decided to fight it. Ford had always believed that the American farmer was the foundation of the American economy. He grew up on a farm in Dearborn, Michigan. He knew what it meant to work the land. He knew what it meant to be at the mercy of forces you didn't control. And from the very beginning, his vision for the automobile was tied directly to the farm. He didn't just want to build cars. He wanted to build cars that farmers could afford, drive, and fuel from their own land. The Model T was originally designed to run on ethanol, gasoline, or any mixture of the two. That flexibility was not an accident. Ford built it in deliberately. He believed farmers should be able to grow their own fuel the same way they grew their own food. He said it plainly in a 1925 interview with a newspaper in New York. He said the fuel of the future would come from the farm. He said oil was a temporary solution, a bridge, not a destination. Most people read that quote and smiled politely. They thought it was nostalgic idealism from a man who had grown up pulling plows. But Ford wasn't being nostalgic. He was being precise. Because by 1925, he had already been working on the engineering for nearly 2 decades, and the results he was getting were extraordinary. Here is what Ford's engineers had figured out that almost nobody outside his laboratories knew. Ethanol, pure alcohol distilled from plant material, burns more efficiently than gasoline in a high-compression engine. Not slightly more efficiently, significantly. A high-compression engine tuned for ethanol produces more power per unit of fuel than the same engine running on gasoline. The reason comes down to chemistry. Ethanol has a higher octane rating than standard gasoline. That means it resists pre-ignition, the engine knock that limits how much compression you can safely run. More compression means more power from the same amount of fuel. Ford's engineers were building engines specifically designed to exploit that property. And when those engines ran on pure agricultural ethanol, the performance numbers were startling. But it got stranger. Because ethanol doesn't just burn more efficiently than gasoline, it also burns cleaner, dramatically cleaner. The exhaust from an ethanol engine contains far lower levels of the toxic compounds that gasoline combustion produces. Ford's engineers knew this. They also knew something that transformed the entire economic argument. You could grow ethanol from almost anything. Corn was the most obvious crop in America's heartland. But Ford's team was experimenting with hemp, the fast-growing plant that produces thick, fibrous stalks and can be harvested within 90 days. Hemp grew on poor soil. It grew fast. It produced massive yields of plant material per acre. And when that plant material was fermented and distilled into alcohol, it produced a fuel that was clean, powerful, and renewable. 1 acre of hemp, properly cultivated, could produce enough ethanol to fuel a vehicle for a full year of average use. At 1930s crop prices, that fuel cost somewhere between $1 and $2 per year, not per tank, per year. That number was not theoretical. It was calculated from actual field tests run on Ford's farms in Michigan. And when Ford's team presented those numbers internally, everyone in the room understood what they meant. If this technology reached the market, the oil industry was finished. Ford's interest in plant-based materials went far beyond fuel. By the early 1930s, he had become genuinely obsessed with the idea that the automobile of the future would be grown, not mined. He had researchers experimenting with soy-based plastics, hemp fiber body panels, and corn-derived lubricants. He believed that the farm and the factory were not separate worlds. They were 2 halves of the same system. And his most dramatic demonstration of that belief came in 1941, the year he unveiled what the press immediately nicknamed the hemp car. Ford himself never used that name publicly. Internally, his team called it the soybean car because the panels were made primarily from a composite of soy fiber, hemp, sisal, and wheat straw. But whatever you called it, the vehicle Ford drove out in front of cameras in August of 1941 was unlike anything the world had seen. The body panels were made entirely from agricultural fiber composite. They were lighter than steel. They were stronger than steel. Ford stood next to the car, holding an axe, and swung it hard into the rear quarter panel. The axe bounced back. The panel was undamaged. A photographer captured the moment, and it ran in papers across the country. People stared at the image, trying to understand what they were looking at. A car body that could absorb an axe blow without denting. A car body grown on a farm. Ford claimed the composite panels were 10 times more resistant to denting than steel, and the car was designed to run on ethanol distilled from hemp and other crops. The fuel and the body, both from plants, both renewable, both cheaper than the industrial alternatives by a margin that made the economics of Standard Oil look fragile. And then, 5 months later, the United States entered World War II, and everything changed. The war gave the federal government extraordinary powers over the American economy. Steel was rationed, rubber was rationed, and in the chaos of wartime production priorities, Ford's experimental vehicle program was quietly shelved. The prototype was stored in a facility in Dearborn. Then it disappeared. No photographs of its interior have ever surfaced. No engineering specifications were ever published. The single surviving axe blow photograph became the only visual record of a vehicle that Ford himself believed was the future of transportation. When the war ended, Ford was 81 years old. He died in April of 1947, and with him died the institutional momentum behind the plant-based vehicle program. His successors were not interested in agricultural composites or hemp ethanol. They were interested in selling as many steel-bodied, gasoline-powered cars as possible. The post-war economic boom was fueling the most extraordinary expansion of automobile culture in human history. Gasoline was cheap. Nobody was asking questions. But here is what nobody talked about publicly. The reason gasoline was cheap in the post-war years had almost nothing to do with abundance. It had to do with policy. The oil depletion allowance, a provision letting oil companies deduct a massive percentage of their revenues, was one of the most generous subsidies in American tax history. Major oil companies paid effective tax rates that were a fraction of what other industries paid. That subsidy made gasoline artificially cheap, cheaper than it would have been in a free market. And that artificial cheapness made every alternative look expensive by comparison. Hemp ethanol didn't get preferential tax treatment. It got the opposite, because in 1937 the federal government had passed the Marijuana Tax Act, which made hemp cultivation effectively illegal for most commercial purposes. The crop that Ford believed was the cornerstone of the fuel economy of the future had become a controlled substance. The timing was, depending on how charitable you choose to be, extraordinary. DuPont had just patented nylon. Major newspaper interests had enormous investments in timber for paper production. And hemp, which produces stronger fiber than cotton, better paper pulp than wood, and apparently competitive fuel, was cutting into both markets. The congressional testimony that led to the Hemp Tax Act was notoriously thin on scientific evidence. The plant was buried under legislation before most Americans had ever seriously considered it as an industrial crop. And Ford's agricultural fuel program lost its most promising raw material. It is important to be precise here about what we know and what is interpretation. We know Ford built a car with plant-based body panels. We know it was designed to run on ethanol. We know ethanol from crops is technically viable and produces cleaner combustion than gasoline. We know Standard Oil lobbied aggressively against ethanol fuel mandates throughout the 1920s and 1930s. Whether all of this was a coordinated conspiracy or a convergence of separate interests that happened to produce the same outcome is something historians still debate. But the outcome itself is not in debate. The plant fuel future that Ford believed in was gone, and it stayed gone for a very long time. In the decades after World War II, a small but persistent community of researchers kept working on agricultural fuels, not because it was fashionable, because the math kept working. In the 1970s, when the OPEC oil embargo hit the United States and gas prices tripled overnight, suddenly everyone wanted to hear about alternatives. Brazil launched the most ambitious biofuel program in history, converting a massive portion of its automobile fleet to run on sugarcane ethanol. It worked. Today, Brazil is energy independent in ways the United States is not, in large part because of decisions made during that crisis. And in the early 2000s, something happened in the materials science community that sent a quiet shockwave through engineering departments around the world. A research team ran detailed tests on hemp fiber composite using modern production methods and equipment. The results were startling. Hemp fiber composite, produced with current technology, is not just competitive with steel and carbon fiber in automotive applications. In certain critical metrics, impact resistance, weight-to-strength ratio, and biodegradability, it outperforms both. The thing Ford tried to build in 1941 could be built again, better, cheaper, at scale. In recent years, the story of Ford's plant-based vehicle has begun circulating again, not just in alternative history forums, in peer-reviewed engineering journals, and materials science conferences, in the research divisions of companies you've heard of. The International Energy Agency now projects that biofuels will be one of the fastest growing segments of the global energy market through 2030. Hemp was slowly re-legalized for industrial cultivation in the United States through the 2014 and 2018 farm bills. The crop that Ford believed in is coming back, and it is bringing its numbers with it. 90 days from seed to harvest, massive fiber and fuel yield per acre, growing on poor soil that other crops won't touch. The engineering case for what Ford was building is stronger today than it was in 1941, and that raises a question that nobody in the mainstream press wants to ask directly. What would fuel prices look like if Ford's program had been allowed to continue? What would air quality look like? What would America's relationship with the Middle East look like? These are not questions with clean answers. History doesn't run in parallel tracks, but they are questions worth sitting with. Because the technology was real, Ford proved that. The economics were viable. Ford calculated that. And the institutional forces that stopped it were not inevitable. They were choices. Choices made by specific people with specific interests at a specific moment in history. And those choices echoed across an entire century. Sit with that for a moment. Henry Ford was not a saint. He held views that history has rightly condemned. He was complicated in ways that a simple tribute would dishonor. But on this specific question, on the question of where fuel should come from and who should control it, he was right, decades ahead of his time, and right. He looked at the American landscape and saw not just agriculture. He saw energy. He saw materials. He saw independence. He saw a future where the price of fuel was set by weather and soil and the labor of American farmers rather than by cartels and drilling rights and geopolitical calculations made thousands of miles from the people paying at the pump. That future was possible. It was close, and it was stopped. Not by physics, not by economics, by power. By the same concentrated institutional power that Ford had spent his entire career railing against. The argument that ended Ford's plant fuel program was not scientific. Nobody proved the ethanol engine didn't work. Nobody published a study showing hemp composite was structurally inferior. The argument was simpler than that. It was quieter. It was the argument that power always makes when it feels threatened. The canceled project, the shelved prototype, the gentle redirection of institutional money away from the dangerous idea and toward the safe one. It was the argument of silence. And silence is the most powerful argument in history, because it leaves no record to argue against. All that remained was one photograph. Henry Ford, standing next to a car body grown on a farm, holding an axe, smiling, as if he knew something, as if the plant growing in the field outside was patient enough to wait. A century is a long time, but some ideas don't die. They just wait. And the fields are growing again,